So welcome everyone. Today we're going to share what City's Open Source Programme Office has done to implement a policy to make open source contribution easier for developers. We're then going to bring it to life with some real life examples of the problems that some of our developers have gone through and how we've resolved them. So if you don't know who we are, I'm Katrina Novakovic. I'm City's open source culture lead. I deal with the people, processes, ways of working within City, and I also lead our inner source initiative.
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm the operations lead of City's Open Source Program Office. Previously to that, joined City a year ago. I was the CTO and co-founder of a startup, mainly focused on finding and fixing open source vulnerabilities. At one point, we actually found, I think it was more vulnerabilities than any CNA on the planet, which was pretty cool. And that was recently acquired last year by a company called Protect AI. I think it kind of says on the tin what it does, but yeah, focused on finding and fixing vulnerabilities in AI.
So just to set the scene, so at City, we've been contributing to open source for many, many years. However, previously, it's been done within pockets across the bank, and depending what kind of sector or group that you were in, depending on the process you followed, who you'd have to ask for approvals, and there wasn't really a consistent process, so it was easier or more difficult depending on where you were within the organisation. I've done the wrong bit, but it doesn't matter. So, as we all know, to set the scene properly this time, I've heard yesterday in a lot of talks that actually lots of people have said that open source is basically running the world. I don't think that's disputed. A lot of developers are consuming open source, and actually everyone is using open source. And so people are using open source, but also developers want to contribute to open source. There's so many reasons. They don't want to maintain their own forks. They want to improve their skills and coding skills and communication. So the problem isn't that we're trying to encourage and convince people to contribute to open source. They want to do that.
Okay, well, yeah, thanks, Kat. So I guess we're all agreed on that. What's the problem? Well, we've been speaking to our developers, and these are some of the things they're saying. And again, people have said this throughout the conference, maybe preaching to the choir. But look, I think organizations are at different levels of maturity. This may be obvious to some, it may not be so obvious to others. But there's fear for developers working in larger institutions. They're afraid that they'll accidentally leak data, as an example. They're afraid maybe they're leaking intellectual property. How do they know, right? They know CI/CD, they know AI, they know Python, they know building applications, right? So there's that aspect to it. There's also the frictions, right? I mean, when it comes to actually putting some form of process in place, when it comes to, let's say, a CCLA. Okay, hey, your average developer, go ahead and sign a CCLA. You want me to sign this, what appears to be legal document? I don't know, I'm not so keen. So friction, yeah, it is there. It's important to recognize this. But as I said, these are some of the things we're hearing. And is it surprising? I mean, looking from the 2022 World of Open Source Europe Spotlight, 53%, at least for our sector, obviously we're a financial and industry bank, 53% of organizations in this space, they don't actually have a clear contribution policy. Right now, okay, sure, I was in a startup before. 4 people. All right, 4 people, maybe that's a little easier to manage. But when we're talking about 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 developers, you can see how this can go wrong, can go awry very quickly.
So as I was saying previously, we've been doing a lot of contribution to open source, but there was no consistent way. So at City, we wanted to come up with a clear, consistent open source contribution policy that everyone could follow across the bank globally. And when we thought about how to create this, we wanted to have this developer-first mindset. So we put the developer at the forefront of the workflows and how that we're doing things. And it's a policy that prioritizes the developer. And it can be difficult enough to get started with open source. So we wanted to kind of separate out the actual code contribution part with all the governance and things and policies that go alongside with it. And we had the Open Source Programs Office, the OSPO, to reduce that burden for developers to take care of those governance aspects.
Now, we're talking about listening to our developers, putting them at the center of this process, right? The center of this policy. So I think it's probably relevant to think about what it is that developers want. Let's start from the top. Familiar territory. How many of us go to web applications that look like they do something and do another? different spaces, different portals. This is not familiar territory for developers. They want to be in their terminal, they want to be in their IDE, they want to be working in their repositories. Okay, you tell them to go elsewhere. Obviously, the initial question is going to be, well, why? And if it's not, eventually the friction, it's going to push them away from it. Fear-free, right? It's important that when they're contributing, as we mentioned before, that they don't have this fear instilled in them, okay? And I think that comes more from, the bigger size. As we said earlier, for startups, you're not really going to see that. But, culture in an organization of 20,000 plus developers, it's, you're going to have different silos. You're going to have, oh, he said, she said, this is the approach that person said. It can be a bit murky, a bit messy. It's important that developers have bragging rights. I've spoken to various organizations who are approaching open source contribution, and they may have approaches where, they remove the identity in the commit. The code is not clear that it belonged or was created by some developer. It's crucial for our developers that when they're creating code and pushing it to the open source world, they're represented by that. They want to use it for profile building. And lastly, there's the transparency aspect. Personally, again, working in a team of 4, information flows extremely quickly, right? But I think there's also truth to the last point here, which is information that is public, maybe even public to your own organization, be it a GitHub organization or some documentation, potentially about the flow, the process that exists within your organization. This can be pretty useful. Developers spend a lot of time on Google, right? Imagine if they type in your company in open source and bang, they've got everything they need. They don't need to find the right portal to search something. They don't need to go through all these various systems which may take them to certain information that's useful.
So with all of this in mind, giving developers what they want, they also just want a simple process to follow. So we've given them a low-touch governance. So all they do is they raise a simple request to contribute, and this is just sending an email with just some information saying who they are, getting their manager's line manager's approval, and then information about like the GitHub repository that they want to contribute to. And then they send this over to the OSBO that does all these compliance checks and things like that. And then typically they then approve it, and the contributor can then go ahead and contribute to open source. Simple.
So what does this look like for the developer? Well, we're trying to think of it as like this yellow brick road of code, right? And I know, for anyone who's familiar with GitHub, you'd probably actually call it a green brick road. But the point being that we want it to be extremely low touch, some form of high frequency process whereby the developer does push and nothing changes, at least not too much changes for them, right? There is always going to be an element of friction, but for us, it's more about the experience of that friction. Of course, we're going to have checks around license compliance. Of course, we're going to have checks around, is this project a project that they actually can contribute to? But for us, it's really about where do we put that process, right? And at what point do we put that process? So from the developer's perspective, right, maybe it doesn't feel like such a friction anymore.
So from the developer's point of view, it's quite simple, but behind the scenes, the Open Source Programs Office does a lot of this governance that I spoke about. So the first point here, project inventory. So the OSBO maintain a list of approved projects and foundations that they've done checks on to check that they're okay to contribute to. And we also maintain a list of contributors and maintainers. And then also we contact internally any budget holders and any accountable parties. And we assign like a project administrator and a foundation administrator to look after that project and be the point of contact internally for it. But from a developer's point of view, they just know, oh, I've got this list of approved projects, I know what I can contribute to. Kind of similarly, we have a list of the open source licenses that have been approved by the Open Source Programs Office, and also the CLAs and DCOs. If somebody's looking to contribute to an open source project, they can have a look to see if that license has already been approved. If it has, it's kind of a tick box. If it hasn't been approved, then the OSBO will go and contact the legal representatives to get that review and approval. So the developer doesn't have to do any of that. And then we also do kind of compliance and get permissions. But from the developer's point of view, they've kind of got the license approved and they know all the IP implications of that. We then got tooling in place. We've got Git proxy, which is a data leakage platform. And basically, once a developer writes code, they use Git proxy then to scan that code, and it forces a peer review check. And they know that any data that's then pushed out doesn't have any sensitive information or any secrets that are going out. So from their point of view, they think, I can now contribute safely. I know I'm not pushing out anything that I shouldn't be.
Okay, cool. So we've kind of spoken about, our high-level process. We've gone into a bit about policy. Let's actually talk about some practical examples. Let's go into some developer stories, real developer stories. So first of all, supply chain security. I think this is all something that is, or probably should be, close to our hearts as an OSPO. So we had a case where we had 5 monthly active developers, mostly working off of personal devices from home, contributing to a group of open source projects. Dependency Track, award-winning, recognized by the security community. It works in composition analysis. They recently won a SANS Institute Award for Best Open Source Tool of the Year. And we're proud at City, that we've already got developers doing this stuff, right? So there's an aspect here of actually bringing these people to the forefront, that this stuff is already happening inside your organizations. They should be brought to the forefront and recognized for their activity. But what we recognized and saw that was kind of breaking the developer experience for them is that they weren't actually able to contribute from the company network. Now, we had, fair good reason for this, reason that's existed before, the OSPO kind of swept in, which is, we had information security policies which were directly preventing right access to GitHub. Well, you can ask why. From our perspective, it's around data leakage. It's around IP leakage. If you've got that channel wide open, the gate is wide open, yes, it is likely that you will see these things happening, right? So it was kind of a forced stop, and that makes sense. So OSS contribution on the company network and hardware was just not possible, resulting in this fragmented developer experience. And so depending on where you were working, be it home, working from the office, especially with hybrid models, especially, for developers these days, and access to specific hardware, it made it very difficult to plan working on a project, right? Imagine if you go to work as a developer and you're fully working from the office and you don't know what your situation is going to be with regards to connecting to a repository, working on a repository. Oh, sorry, today you can't work on that repository. Now, for 5 developers, that doesn't sound like a lot. Cool. Let's talk about 20,000 developers. Let's talk about 30,000 developers. How much does that rack up every week? I would argue quite a lot. So the City OSPO steps in. Woohoo! So the end goal being that they were able to contribute from the internal network. We put in place Git proxy, right? We measured our risk. We assessed the risk. We said, well, what is the quantifiable risk of contributing from inside the network? What are the things that we need to de-risk with various parts of legal, security, and what is it that they want to see from us when actually allowing developers to contribute to open source? So for us, all that occurred in Git proxy and does occur in Git proxy. Now, we also gave our developers the option to contribute to a centralized GitHub organization. This is fairly common, but for us, we recognize, well, they've been working from home. It's been occurring on personal forks. If they want, as an option, it's good to have options, I think, rather than sort of, enforcing certain standards. There are benefits and drawbacks, of course, versus like a distributed approach versus central approach. But we wanted them to have the opportunity to collaborate before they were merging changes upstream. Kind of a last resort before they opened up their pull requests. And then it closed the loop, right? So here we see the office on the left, but they were consuming the open source library back into City. Ultimately, we enabled our developers regardless of location, but whilst also reassuring them of leakage risks, IP risks, and removing that kind of fear element that was likely there. Happy days. Okay, so we've done our first case study. Let's go into our second one, which is around inactive open source. Ooh. So I'd like to introduce you to a great friend of mine. This is Igor. And like many developers at City, Igor was consuming open source. As Kat said, it's, to a degree, almost impossible to not be these days. But we look at this and it makes sense. He used open source, he built an application, and he shipped it to production. Now, one of those open source libraries had a vulnerability in it, right? CVE popped up, maybe he discovered it himself, but there was also some version incompatibility issues. Now, in terms of our CI/CD process, not permissible. Sorry, we're going to have to stop production there. Your application's going to have to wait. You need to get this solved. So he couldn't release. Now, there are a couple options for Igor, right? A couple which may be more preferable than the others. The green probably demonstrates the most preferable, but let's start at the top. So Igor could have actually done a monkey patch, right? He could have opened up the library that was sitting in the application and directly changed the contents of the code at runtime. So Why not ideal? Well, it goes under the hood. There's no CVE infrastructure around it. Yes, you may have some tooling which can, pop up on, the vulnerability around the business logic itself. But ideally, you don't want it going under that hood. Readability, goes through the floor. People come in the future to take on this application. They're like, what on earth is going on here? Why is there a change to this dependency in an application? Number 2, Igor could have created an internal fork. Not my favorite. At the end of the day, look, it depends. We have to accept we're not going to be perfect. These things are going to happen. And in some cases, we may actually need to enable it, right, to kind of get to that end goal where maybe developers don't have to create internal forks at all. But cost, right? I mean, what's the point of Igor maintaining essentially a complete copy of an open source project, having to do all the maintenance himself? Doesn't make sense, right? He could have found an alternative, but not necessarily ideal. I mean, look, open source is rich, there's a lot of choice, and in some cases, probably in a lot of cases, actually, I would recommend it, right, because it's so rich. Depends on ecosystem, of course, depends. But would it have met all of his requirements? Well, maybe not. Now, what's the cost there? What's the time there? How long does it take him to get back to the point where he's met all the other requirements for his application for that library? But ideally, number 4, green, go ahead. Let's go upstream. Let's fix this stuff. Let's get you out there. Let's work on a repository and let's open a pull request. So great, that's what Igor chose. Awesome. He worked on a vulnerability patch, he improved and fixed the version compatibility issue, and he opened a pull request to the upstream repository. But a bit of an issue. Well, there was a huge, fairly large backlog of PRs. I shouldn't say huge. I mean, we're not talking about hundreds here. We're actually talking 10s, 20s, 30s. But most importantly, the repository wasn't that active. The most active, last active contribution on the repository was about 2 years ago. So long story short, we couldn't necessarily wait around. We had an application, purpose, and I'm not necessarily advocating, and I'll get into it for, okay, well, waiting around, now let's just go and fork, okay? I think there's an element here of you don't want to pollute open source. But we decided to go for that after about a month or 2 trying to contact the maintainer. We didn't have too much success. So we forked and published. And we worked with Gradle. We wanted to make sure we were being responsible about it. We didn't want to create pollutionware, as I said. So, we spoke to them. They said, please, before we go into, creating a fork and a subsequent set of very similar libraries, let's really make sure that the maintainer, has given some form of last response and we can proceed. So, props to Gradle for doing that. That's awesome. Ultimately, though, we were lucky. The maintainer actually responded. They said, I really don't have a huge amount of time right now to look after this repository. More than happy, as it says here, to redirect, our repository to your new fork. Thanks for taking over and good luck. And that was it, right? Igor was unblocked. He was able to work on the repository. There was an element of, we removed that potential guilt of this kind of corporation sweeping in and copying code and taking over something that someone had done in the past. So that's why I do say, one, props to Gradle for kind of putting that step in place. It's not necessarily obvious, but ultimately, I think we went down the right path. We were happy with the maintainer's response. They were happy we kind of took it from them, and Igor was able to continue with building out his application and pushing to production. So what did we learn? Well, education and enablement is probably the first one. From my knowledge, I don't think Igor had ever gone through that full process, right, of working, let alone on an open source repository, publishing an open source project, reconsuming it. Think about the full life cycle that Igor went through, starting just from consuming open source, consuming, hoping maybe something will get fixed, all the way to fixing something, working with the maintainers in the open source community to, how do we move forward? How do we go to the next step? All the way to reconsuming it. So he's gone through that full cycle. There's a great opportunity for education enablement. To a degree, it eliminated malpractice, right? I mean, we went through all the squares at the top, 1 to 4, which was, we didn't end up monkey patching, we didn't end up creating internal forks, and we didn't necessarily have to move towards an alternative. Now, it's important to recognize here that when I say malpractice, as I said actually before, it's not really always malpractice, right? It's important to go at this iteratively. We don't have to kill all internal forks today. We don't even have to do it tomorrow. But as long as we can kind of set some sort of path towards, what we might say is, in some cases the best alternative, it's a great start. And ultimately, I think we upgraded the developer experience.
So Jamie's just shared kind of 2 examples where we've had code contribution, but we also wanted to highlight that we encourage our developers to do non-code contributions as well. And we think it's important that developers have their voice in the community, so it's not just pushing code out there, but being part of the conversation and, collaborating with others. And there's various ways they can do this. So we've got community forums. Just collaborating with others could be just on GitHub directly via issues. It could be in Slack channels, and it could be all sorts of places. And as I'm sure we know here, it's not that easy to get people in Slack channels and talking openly. We've also had people, we encourage them to join working groups. So we really encourage participation in the FinOS working groups. We're members of kind of Common Cloud Controls, DEI, and also the open source readiness groups, where we have people collaborating together, and it's not just code contributions, as I said. We also got people on technical steering committees, and we've also got board members. So we've got Ridin here, who's the chair of the FinOS board, where he's got that position due to kind of the skills and experience within the finance industry, but also because of the participation in open source communities. So City are on a journey of being open. We'd like you to go and view our, we spoke about the policy, and we'd like you to view our guidelines that we've published that are available on github.com/city/city-osbo. And here you can view our guidelines that we have, and you can see if they apply to your organization and see if you can learn anything from them yourselves.
And if you'd like to build that yellow brick road that I mentioned, Git proxy, go to github.com/finos/Git proxy. Look, we're not in a perfect position today. We've got a way to go. We don't have all the answers, as I hope I've demonstrated. But I think ultimately the developer comes first here, right? Especially for large organizations where you're going to have these breakouts as silos and cultures, and it can be hard to bring that together. And I think through controls, through improved automation, policy driving that, I think we'll all have a better outcome together. So, if you're interested, I've got time for you. I'll take as much time to answer any of your questions any day. So please, get in touch via GitHub, message me personally. More than happy.
And you can also go to our City GitHub organization, which is github.com/city. And here you can find out about some of the other projects that we're participating in, and also that we've created ourselves as well. And I would like to ask if you can please follow us and just keep up to date with what's going on.